Today, we're doing something pretty cool, something I've wanted to do for a long time. I've done a lot of manual swaps, but never on a Cherokee, so that kind of gives it away, and probably the title does as well. But today, we're gonna be swapping out the automatic transmission, the AW4, from this Jeep Cherokee, and we're gonna be swapping in a 5-speed manual transmission. Now there's a couple things that you want to look out for when you're doing this swap, and I'll go through that process and the things you want to avoid, certain parts you want to avoid, years that you want to try to pull parts from, or if you're purchasing stuff, make sure you get the right stuff online. Now with that being said, some of the stuff that I'm telling you about and warning you about, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do the opposite of it, and there is a reason for that. I'll get into it a little bit, but let me go and I'll give you an overview on the swap. I'll lay all the parts out and show you what you need. I'll tell you what to look for. I'll point out certain things, and then we'll actually get into the process, and I'll show you the entire thing, start to finish, of removing the transmission, taking all the automatic stuff out, swapping over the manual stuff, which you're going to want to do in certain areas, and then wrapping everything up. So let's take a look at the pieces now. First off, and probably the most obvious, is going to be you need a transmission. You need a manual transmission. I usually grab them from the junkyards. I have You Pull and Pay, or LKQ. That's what I got where I'm at. But other locations, they got different stuff and they got different prices. Not a big deal. Now when you're grabbing a manual transmission, what I would recommend is getting an AX15. You're gonna find those in anywhere from, I think, 1988 and a half on Jeep Cherokees up to 2001, maybe, the last year that they made the Cherokee. You can also find them in later model Wranglers, and you can also find AX15s in Wranglers. That's a much stronger transmission, and that's what you want. I have one laying on the ground over there that I can show you what it looks like for reference. But what I grabbed is a Peugeot BA 10.5. This came out of a 1988, and unfortunately it was the only manual they had in the junkyard that day, and it was across town, so that's what I picked up. Now it does shift through all the gears sitting here on the ground, and the clutch did work when I was in the junkyard with it. So this is a lot weaker of a transmission. They stopped using them, I believe, midway through 1988. If not, definitely in 1989. Anything earlier or later than that, you're not going to have this Peugeot BA 10.5 transmission. But like I said, I have an AX15 sitting on the ground. I'm not using it because I'm probably going to use for another project. But with that being said, try to get an AX15. Do not get the Peugeot if you can avoid it. Now the other thing to mention is when you're swapping in this transmission, try to get an AX15 on Cherokee. Now this applies to Cherokees. That is model year 1994 and up. So 1993, don't grab it. 92, don't grab it. You can, but the big difference on that is going to be your internal versus your external slave cylinder. Now let me take off the camera to show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so let's jump down here and take a look at this transmission a little closer. Now, before I go into the slave stuff, the Peugeot is pretty easily identified. You've got this big split right down the case. It's on the top of the transmission and the bottom. It literally comes in half. It's two pieces, like a suitcase or a briefcase. That's your Peugeot transmission. The AX15 does not have any of that. Let me take you over there, show you what one of those looks like real quick. This guy, it has the boot on it, but you can see that, like, I don't know, grid pattern, waffle pattern, that it looks a little bit different, and you can really tell the difference. It doesn't have a big split right down the middle with bolts. So that's an easy way to tell an AX15 from a Peugeot. Now, what I was saying there, the Peugeot, all of them will be internal slave, and all of the AX15s will be, well, not all of them. Some of the AX15s are going to be internal. Some will be external slave, and this is what I'm talking about. If you look inside the bell housing, anything 1993 and younger or and older on a Cherokee has this internal slave. So the slave is inside the bell housing, and it's a pain in the butt. It gets these little hydraulic lines that goes out of there, and that hooks up to your clutch master lines. And the master's still bolted on the firewall, but this is what actuates your pressure plate in your clutch. These things are kind of junk. A lot of times they end up bleeding down, leaking fluid, giving out, and in order to replace this, you have to remove the entire transmission to take out and roll just to replace this one piece. If you get an externally mounted slave cylinder, which is on model years 94 and earlier, or and up, 94 and up, you will not have to deal with that. I got one sitting in the backyard, so let me show you that. Okay, this is my 91 Cherokee, and it has a external slave. Now I did make a video on how to do this because this originally, 92, it would not have come with an external slave, it came with an internal slave cylinder, just like I showed you on the ground. You can swap the bell housing on the front and some of the bearing retainer and some other parts, but this is what an external slave cylinder will look like. You see this guy right here, 2 bolts coming out from the driver's side of the bell housing. You got a clutch fork inside there, and all you do is take those 2 bolts off, then you can remove this entire clutch master and slave unit. Instead of having to pull the entire transmission off to replace a slave, you just take 2 bolts off. So go with anything 1994 and up on the Cherokees. Now the other thing that you need to pay attention to when you're doing this swap, now I know this is a common thing that people run into when they're ditching the Peugeot transmission and swapping to an AX15, is the spline count on the output shaft of the transmission and the spline count on the input shaft of your transfer case. They need to match up. Now the Peugeot, it's a 21 count spline, I can tell you that for sure. And the AX15, from what I've read online, is a 23. But let me go count that right now and then I'll let you know for sure. Okay, so the spline count on the output shaft of the AX15 is 23. There's 23 splines. So if you look here, 1 spline, 2 spline, 3 spline, you're just counting those little mountains. That's your spline. There's 23 around on the AX15, and there's only 21 on the Peugeot. So that means if you're swapping out a Peugeot for an AX15, you need to do something about the transmission or the transfer case. You either need to get a transfer case that has a 23 spline count input shaft, or you need to take the input shaft out of the transfer case that you have and replace it with one that has a 23 count input shaft out of the transfer case, maybe that's in a junkyard, or you can order this stuff online as well, but the costs start to add up. So that's something to pay attention to. I will let you know what the spline count is coming off the back of the AW4, but I'm fairly certain it's going to be 23. Now for this swap, for me, luckily I had an extra Cherokee that I had purchased, and it came with a spare transfer case, and that transfer case is out of an 88. So for whatever reason, it just lucked out that I had this correct spline count transfer case. This is a 248, I believe. It's got the full-time 4-wheel drive, not as strong, but we don't really care for this. And then I've got the correct spline count on that guy. So the other thing would be transmission mounts. The Peugeot mount is going to be different than your AX15, and I think it's going to be different than the AW4 automatic mount. Now the length might be a little different as well. Once I get in there, I'll let you know what I end up doing about the cross member and how I realign it. But let's talk about the other parts that you're going to need to complete this swap. So up here, what you see on the back of the Jeep, try to stay out of the light, is pretty much everything that we're going to need. So we've got our master, and this all came from the junkyard as well. We've got the master that goes into your clutch pedal and bolts to the firewall. I have the line connected to it, and it goes all the way around, and it's got a little J hook right here on the tip, and that connects right up to the slave that comes out of the side of my transmission, since I have an internal slave instead of an external slave. You're also going to need a pedal or a pedal assembly. I would just grab something from the junkyard if you can. You can probably fab up a pedal, but then you're going to have to deal with clutch master depth and a lot of that kind of stuff. This is all already set up. It's a couple bolts. It just bolts right into the firewall. You've got to remove obviously the clutch master and then the brake booster bolts, and then 2 bolts to the firewall, and that's about it for mounting this guy in the junkyard. Then aside from that, you're going to need the flywheel, because in an automatic you have a flex plate. So you're going to want to grab one of those, ideally not with rocks in it. Now what I'd also recommend is grabbing the flywheel bolts. Let's see, flywheel bolt along with the pressure plate bolts. Now I'll let you know, the flywheel bolts, they could be the same as the flex plate bolts that you take out of your automatic, but I know a flex plate is a lot thinner than a flywheel, so I don't think it's going to be the same. It could be, I'll let you know. I grabbed these when I was in the junkyard anyways, because it's right there once you pull the transmission off. Now the pressure plate bolts, I mean, you could probably look this up online and buy it from Ace Hardware, but if you're in the junkyard, just take them out of the pressure plate. Junkyards usually don't charge you for little bolts like this, and you're not going to have these if you're coming from an automatic. So the other just small little odds and ends, there'll be these, darn, can't remember the name of it right now, but like a cotter pin basically, but not really, and then also a little like washer. These are all part of your clutch pedal assembly. Make sure you grab them when you get this stuff from the junkyard. There's small little pieces like that that you'd rather have, and they're so easy when you're in the junkyard to get them, but probably so difficult to find later on. Other than that, we're going to reuse our cross member and everything else. So I think that pretty much does it. And now we can get into the actual swap here. So let's get set up for that. One last thing I forgot to mention. When you do this, a couple tools that you don't need. I've got a 2-post lift, so I can do this while I'm standing. But I've done this on the ground, outside. I've done it in single car garages with 0 jacks. It just makes your life a lot more difficult, and it's going to be stressful. At a bare minimum, get a transmission jack from Harbor Freight. And you could do it on the ground. It makes life so much easier instead of trying to use the little bottle jacks or trying to bench press the transmission up there and line everything up. Aside from that, you're going to need an E12 Torx socket. And I'll show you what that looks like and why you need it to get the top 2 bell housing bolts on. All right, let's lift the Jeep up now.